3 alien landing craft touched down on a mudflat in the top end of northern Australia. Their sensors found no threats, no heat signatures, no movement. Just a long brown shape in the shallows that their systems marked as floating debris, 19 feet of it, and it was already awake. If you enjoy stories where humanity wins in the strangest way possible, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who thinks Australia is just a vacation destination. And when the ending hits, tell me in the comments whether you saw it coming, because nobody in this story did. Now let's move forward and step onto the riverbank where the invasion of Earth quietly fell apart. The Kalinda River sat in the top end of the Northern Territory like a long brown vein cut through a green floodplain. It ran 40 miles inland from the coast, and for every one of those 40 miles it was tidal. Salt water pushed up it twice a day, then dragged itself back out and left 100 yards of gray mud shining under the sun. The locals had a saying about that mud. If you can see the bottom of the river, you are already too close to it. At the narrowest point in the river, somebody had poured a concrete causeway across the water and called it Kalinda Crossing. It was low, flat, and completely unremarkable, except for one detail. At low tide, you could drive across it. At high tide, it vanished under 8 feet of moving salt water. Between those two states, there was a window of about 20 minutes where the crossing was technically passable and absolutely not advisable. There were 4 warning signs at the eastern approach. Corporal Wheeze Tanner had read all of them out loud every single morning for 11 weeks. "Crocodiles inhabit this area," he announced. "Attacks may cause serious injury or death. Do not enter the water. You did that yesterday," said Private Danny Kessler. "The sign is still here. Somebody has to honor it." Tanner unfolded his camp chair on the concrete apron above the crossing and sat down in it with the satisfaction of a man who had brought the correct equipment. That chair had come with him from Camp Pendleton, through Darwin, through a rotation at Mount Bundy, and out here to the end of a red dirt track. It had one bent leg and a cup holder full of dried mud. He would not be parted from it. The American detachment at Kalinda was small. 22 Marines from the rotational force out of Darwin, sent inland for 2 weeks of terrain familiarization, which was the official term for standing in a swamp and learning what the swamp thought about you. They were attached to a research station that studied the river, and the research station was mostly one woman with a boat. Dr. Katie Merritt had been working saltwater crocodiles in the top end for 9 years. She had a permanently sunburned nose, a hat that had lost its shape, and the calmest voice of any human being in the territory. She used that voice to say the most alarming sentences imaginable. "Everybody off the ramp, please," she said without looking up from her tablet. "The tide's turning and Deacon likes the ramp when it's turning." The Marines got off the ramp. Deacon was the reason the ramp had a rule. He was a dominant male saltwater crocodile, 19 feet from snout to tail tip, and he had held the middle stretch of the Kalinda for longer than anyone at the station had been alive. Merritt had a file on him 3 inches thick. He had a notch in his upper jaw, 2 missing scoots on his back, and a habit of parking himself in exactly the spot where a person would most like to stand. He was not aggressive. That was the part outsiders never understood. He was territorial. There is an enormous difference, and the difference is that an aggressive animal wants to hurt you. And a territorial animal simply does not recognize that you exist as anything other than a shape standing in his living room. "How big is his territory?" Kessler had asked in the first week. "About 4 miles of river," Merritt said. "Everything in it belongs to him. The fish, the mud, the bank, the boat ramp, and any smaller crocodile stupid enough to argue. What happens to the ones that argue? They stop arguing." Major Ray Dalton commanded the detachment. He was 38, quiet, and carried a laminated safety card in his left breast pocket that the station had issued him on day 1. He had read it so many times the plastic had gone cloudy at the corners. Rule 1. Never stand in the same spot on the bank 2 days running. Rule 2. Never clean fish at the water's edge. Rule 3. Assume every log is not a log. Dalton had turned that card into a religion. His Marines mocked him for it right up until the morning. A 14-foot female came out of the shallows at the exact place Tanner had stood the previous afternoon. And after that, nobody mocked the card anymore. Staff Sergeant Cole Brennan handled the day-to-day. He carried a steel thermos that had survived 3 deployments and had never once been observed empty. He poured coffee for people the way other men handed out cigarettes. "Sir," he said, offering the cup to Dalton, "storm's building over the escarpment." It was. The buildup had arrived, that stretch of weeks before the monsoon when the top end turns into a pressure cooker. 90% humidity, air like warm soup. And every afternoon, thunderheads stacking 60,000 feet into the sky over the Arnhem Land escarpment, throwing more lightning per square mile than almost anywhere else on the planet. Nolan Frey ran the station's boat and fixed everything that broke, which was everything. He looked at the clouds and shrugged. "She'll go up around 4, he said. "We'll lose the radio for an hour." "It's fine, is it?" Kessler asked. "It's fine." Mostly, 10 miles up the track, Ellen Cobb ran the Kalinda Roadhouse, which sold fuel, ice, batteries, and meat pies to a customer base of approximately 9 people. She had come out from Ohio 20 years earlier for a 6-month job and had simply never gone home. That was the entire world at Kalinda Crossing, a river that breathed twice a day. A concrete slab that disappeared, a crocodile with a notch in his jaw, 4 signs nobody obeyed, 22 Marines learning to respect mud. And a storm coming up over the escarpment like it did every afternoon. At 3:40 in the afternoon, the storm arrived early, except it did not sound like a storm. Thunder rolls, this pressed. It was a low, flat, continuous pressure that made the water in Brennan's cup ripple in perfect concentric rings and made every bird on the floodplain go up at once. Merritt looked at the sky and stopped moving entirely. 3 shapes were coming down through the cloud base. They were dark, angular, and far too slow to be falling. They passed over the crossing at maybe 2,000 feet, banked together with a precision no weather system has ever managed, and settled toward the wide gray mudflat at the river's bend. 2 miles downstream, Tanner stood up so fast his chair folded itself. "Sir," he said, "are we supposed to salute that?" Dalton was already reaching for the radio. Frey was already reaching for the boat keys. And Dr. Katie Merritt was doing neither of those things. She was staring downstream at the mudflat, and her face had gone strange, because she was the only person present who understood exactly whose front yard those 3 ships had just parked in. "Oh no," she said quietly. "They landed at the bend." Sub-Marshal Tarek of the Veskin Dominion had chosen Northern Australia personally, and he had chosen it because the numbers were beautiful. The Veskin invasion doctrine was old, tested, and boring in the way that all effective doctrine is boring. You do not land in a city. You land in the emptiest survivable place on the target landmass. You establish a hardened node. You extend a shield lattice, and then you expand outward at a pace the defenders cannot match. The doctrine had worked on 9 worlds. It had a success rate that made careers. So Tarek had spent 2 orbital cycles surveying Earth, and Earth had given him a gift. There was a landmass in the southern hemisphere with an enormous northern coastline, abundant fresh water, flat approach terrain, and a population density so low that his analysts had rerun the survey twice, assuming instrument error. Fewer than 2 individuals per square unit, Observer Pell reported, across an area larger than most of our staging provinces, and military presence, minimal, a single small formation inland. 22 personnel, light equipment, no fixed defenses, no artillery, no armor. Tarek had studied the imaging of the river bend for a long time. Wide, flat, firm ground, excellent sight lines. Water access, a causeway providing a natural choke point for inland expansion. Confirmed the ground bearing strength. Confirmed, Sub-Marshal, the surface is dense sediment. It will hold the landers. It was and it would. Observer Pell was entirely correct. The mudflat at the bend was firm, load-bearing, dry, and cracked into hexagonal plates by the sun, at low tide. Nobody on the Veskin survey team had ever seen a tide with a 20-foot range, because their homeworld had one small moon at a considerable distance, and its seas moved about the width of a hand. The concept existed in their science. It simply did not exist in their instincts, and doctrine is written by instincts, not by science. The 3 landers settled onto the flat with barely a shudder. Ramps dropped. 240 Veskin troopers walked down onto Earth in perfect order, and the first boot print in the mud was crisp enough to photograph. Squad leader Vosk led the perimeter detail. His armor was excellent. It filtered air, regulated temperature, resisted small arms fire, and had performed flawlessly across 4 campaigns. Within 11 minutes on the Kalinda mudflat, the humidity had condensed inside the elbow seals. And by minute 40, the salt in the air had begun a slow chemical conversation with the joint housings that would not conclude for several hours, but would conclude very badly. Environmental note, Vosk transmitted. Atmospheric moisture exceeds tolerance projections. Logged, said Pell. The projections were taken during the dry period. When does the dry period end? Approximately 4 days ago. The perimeter detail moved up the bank toward the tree line. That was where they found the first sign. It stood on 2 steel posts, weathered but perfectly legible, and the translation matrix rendered it in under a second. Crocodiles inhabit this area. Attacks may cause serious injury or death. Do not enter the water. Vosk read it twice. Then he consulted the doctrine. Veskin expansion protocol contained a specific and well-tested clause regarding local marker structures. Primitive populations frequently erected warnings at the boundaries of territory they considered spiritually dangerous. Sacred groves, cursed pools, ancestral ground. The doctrine advised acknowledging such markers politely and then ignoring them completely, because in 9 campaigns not one of them had ever been literal. Classification, Vosk said. Observer Pell keyed it in without hesitation. Superstition marker, local deterrent. No action required. That decision would eventually be discussed at the highest levels of the Veskin Dominion for a very long time. The perimeter went up fast, shield anchors at 40-yard intervals. Sensor buoys dropped into the shallows to monitor the waterway. A tactical lattice projected across the entire bend, tied into thermal, motion, acoustic, and density scanning. It was, by any measure, an excellent net. Then Trooper Wren reported that sensor buoy 4 had stopped transmitting. Cause? Unknown. It simply ended. Retrieve it. 2 troopers waded out to knee depth. They found the tether. They found 16 inches of it. The cut end was not cut. It was frayed outward in a way that suggested the buoy had been removed from the tether at a speed the tether had not been designed to survive. Predator activity? Vosk asked. Pell checked the lattice. Negative. Thermal grid shows no biological signatures in the water. Nothing above ambient temperature within 300 yards. And here is the part that would eventually be printed at the top of an amended Veskin field manual in letters twice the normal size. The thermal grid was working perfectly. That was the problem. A saltwater crocodile is ectothermic. It does not generate its own body heat. It borrows the temperature of the water it lies in, and it holds that temperature so precisely that on a thermal readout a 19-foot animal and the puddle around it are indistinguishable. Every Veskin sensor on that riverbank was calibrated to find warm things moving through cool backgrounds. The Kalinda River had spent 400 million years perfecting the exact opposite. Vosk had the buoys pulled and replaced with density scanners instead. The density scanners worked immediately. Within an hour, they had mapped 11 large objects drifting in the river channel. Pell classified all 11 as floating timber. 9 of them were. At sunset, a battered aluminum boat came up the channel with an outboard motor and 1 human in it. Nolan Frey cut the engine at 40 yards, drifted, and looked at 240 armed aliens, 3 landing craft, and a shield lattice glowing softly in the dusk. The Veskin translation matrix engaged. Vessel, identify. Nolan, said Nolan, you are within a restricted operational zone. Yeah, mate, so are you. He scratched his jaw. Look, I'm not here to start anything. I'm just gonna say one thing and then I'll go. You want to get off that flat before midnight. Explain. Nah, you wouldn't believe me. He put a hand on the starter cord. Also, don't stand at the water's edge. And if you see a log with eyes, that's not a log. Clarify the statement. Can't, gotta go, storm's coming. The outboard caught. The boat turned. Vosk watched it go and logged the entire exchange as an intimidation attempt of extremely poor quality. Behind him, out in the dark channel, one of the 11 pieces of floating timber changed direction against the current. The station's operations room was a demountable building with a ceiling fan, a whiteboard, and a satellite radio that worked in the mornings. By 9 that night, it held every American at Calinda Crossing, plus Ellen Cobb, who had driven down from the roadhouse with a cooler and had refused 3 separate suggestions to leave. "I've got 400 pounds of frozen meat and a generator," she said. "I'm not abandoning that for anybody, terrestrial or otherwise." Major Ray Dalton had spent the last 5 hours doing the least glamorous work in military history. He had reported up the chain. He had been told that Darwin was tracking 11 other landing sites across 4 continents, that the nearest response element was 6 hours out and being retasked twice an hour, and that his standing order was to preserve his people and gather information. He had also counted 22 Marines with rifles, 240 aliens with shields. "So we're not fighting them," Brennan said. It was not a question. "We are not fighting them," Dalton agreed. "We're going to move the civilians, hold the high ground at the station, and find out what they can't do. Everything has a gap." "Find me the gap." That was when Dr. Katie Merritt put her tablet on the table and said the sentence that decided the entire invasion of Earth. "They can't see crocodiles." Everyone looked at her. "Frey got close enough to read their sensor array," she said. "Thermal, motion, acoustic, density, that's a good net. It'd catch a person, a buffalo, a boat, a drone. It will not catch a salty." "Why not?" "Because a salty isn't warm. He's exactly as warm as the water. On thermal, he's a hole shaped like nothing. Motion won't get him either because he doesn't move like prey. He drifts. He can hold station in a current for an hour on one breath with his heart down to 2 or 3 beats a minute." She tapped the table. "And density scanning reads him as a log because that's what he's shaped like. That's the whole design. 400 million years of being the thing that looks like the thing you ignore," Kessler said. "So they parked 240 guys in the middle of the biggest crocodile territory on the river, and their equipment is telling them the river is empty." "Yes, that's the worst possible." "Outcome for them?" "No," Merritt said. "The worst possible outcome is the tide." She drew the river on the whiteboard, she drew the bend, she drew the flat. "The Calinda is tidal for 40 miles. Spring tide range at the bend is a hair over 20 feet. Right now they're sitting on ground that is dry, hard, and load-bearing. In about 5 hours that ground is underwater, not damp, under. And when the water comes up a tidal river against a monsoon rain, it doesn't rise gently. It comes up the channel as a front." Dalton stared at the drawing. "They landed at low tide. They landed at the lowest tide of the month." Brennan poured coffee into a cup that nobody had asked for and handed it to Dalton anyway. "Sir, respectfully." "Our plan is a tide chart. Our plan is a tide chart," Dalton said, "and it is the best plan I have ever had." 2 miles downstream, the Vescan Dominion was having a slightly more difficult evening. Sub-Marshal Tarek had ordered the inland expansion to begin at dusk, per doctrine, and the expansion had gone approximately 40 yards before it met the black soil floodplain. Top-end black soil is a geological practical joke. In the dry, it is concrete. Add water and it becomes something with the grip of wet cement and the enthusiasm of a swamp. The first Vescan armored walker sank to its second joint and stayed there. The second one went around it and sank to its third. "Recommend we route along the ridge line," Vosk transmitted. "Which ridge line?" Vosk indicated a series of tall, narrow, flat-sided earthen structures standing in perfect rows across the plain, each one about 8 feet high. Each one aligned precisely north to south. Those, they appear to be constructed, possibly defensive, possibly grave markers. They were magnetic termite mounds. There were 9,000 of them. They are aligned north to south, because it minimizes the surface exposed to the midday sun, which is a temperature control strategy invented by insects roughly 100 million years before anyone thought to invade anything. Tarek, being a careful officer, ordered 3 of them cleared with a low-yield burst. 6 million termites disagreed. The engineering detail spent the next 90 minutes discovering that if you demolish a termite mound at night in the top end, you do not get an empty space. You get an active one. 2 troopers had to have their helmet seals cut off. Observer Pell logged the incident as biological contact and then had to open a new category because the existing one did not accommodate the phrase, "the ground was full." It got worse in small, specific, humiliating increments. A reconnaissance drone landed on what its imager identified as a small, slow, unarmored amphibian and attempted a tissue sample. The cane toad, being an invasive species with parotoid glands full of a cardiac toxin, did what cane toads do. The drone's intake seized in under a minute. A squad sheltering under a mangrove during the first rain squall came out 90 seconds later at a dead sprint, having discovered green ants, which build their nests in leaves. Defend them with formic acid, and possess an absolutely unshakable commitment to teamwork. And at 11, a feral water buffalo weighing 1,800 pounds walked straight through the eastern shield anchor, because it wanted to be on the other side of the eastern shield anchor. By midnight, Observer Pell's biological hazard index had a structural problem. The index ran from 1 to 5. 5 was described in the manual as apex organism, engagement not advised without support. Pell had assigned 5 to the buffalo, 5 to the termites, and 5 to the toad. He requested authorization to create level 6. Then squad leader Vosk reported that Trooper Wren was missing from the southern bank post. There had been no alarm, no shield breach. No thermal contact, no acoustic event. The lattice showed nothing at all because the lattice was working perfectly. There was a drag mark in the mud, 11 feet long, ending at the water line. Vosk stood at the edge of it and looked out at the Black River, and for the first time in 4 campaigns he felt something his armor could not filter. Out in the dark, something very large exhaled. Then it made a sound. It was not a roar. It was lower than a roar, so low that it arrived in the chest before it arrived in the ears. A long rolling pressure that rattled the loose plates on the landing ramps. And from 4 miles of river, in the mangroves and the side channels and the shallow bays, other things answered it. Deacon had not attacked anything. That is worth being precise about, because the Vescan Dominion would spend a great deal of time afterward insisting that it had been attacked, and it had not been. Deacon had a bank. He had used that bank for basking, for nesting oversight, and for territorial display for longer than the Kalinda station had existed. 240 armored bipeds had walked onto it, planted metal poles in it, projected light over it, and left an object standing at the water line where objects were not permitted to stand. He had removed the object. To a 19-foot dominant male saltwater crocodile, that is not an act of war, that is housekeeping. The bellow at midnight was not a threat display aimed at aliens either. It was a territorial call, and it went out across 4 miles of river the way it did most nights in the buildup. What made this particular night different was that the Vescan landers were running their ground stabilizers, and ground stabilizers hum. Down at the very bottom of the audible range, in the exact band that a crocodile uses to announce that a stretch of water has an owner. Every male croc on the Kalinda heard the biggest bellow of the season coming from the bend. And then, all night, they heard it answer itself. They came upriver to find out who was making that claim. Not as a swarm, not as an army, not in any organized way at all. They came the way territorial animals always come, alone, unhurried, and extremely serious. And by 4 in the morning, there were somewhere between 30 and 40 large saltwater crocodiles distributed through the channel around the bend, all of them profoundly annoyed. All of them invisible to every sensor the Vescan Dominion had brought to Earth. At the station, Major Ray Dalton was working a very different problem. "They'll come for us at first light," he said. "We're the only military formation on their board. Doctrine says clear the local force before expanding. So we're bait," Brennan said. "We're bait with a schedule." Dalton tapped the whiteboard. "Dr. Merritt wins the peak. High water at the crossing is 6:18. The front comes up the channel about 20 minutes ahead of it. And the crossing, drivable until about 5:40, underwater by 6. Dalton looked at the map for a long moment. "Then we give them a reason to be on the wrong side of it at 5:30. The plan was simple, which is why it worked. The station had a generator, a satellite dish, and a radio mast. Dalton had all 3 switched to maximum output and pointed straight at the bend. To a Vescan tactical lattice, the Kalinda research station stopped looking like a demountable building with a ceiling fan and started looking like a command node. At 4:50 in the morning, Submarshal Tarek ordered the advance. It should have been easy. It was one causeway, 80 yards long, defended by a formation that his analysts had rated as light. He committed 160 troopers, 4 walkers, and the forward shield generator. He held 80 in reserve at the landers. Doctrine, as always, was excellent. The Veskin column came up the eastern approach in the gray light before dawn, and passed the 4 warning signs without slowing down. Because they had been classified on the first day, and reclassification requires a formal request. Corporal Wheeze Tanner watched them from the ridge above the crossing, lying on his stomach beside his folded camp chair, which he had carried up there because he was not leaving it for aliens. "Sir," he said into the radio, "they're stacking on the causeway. How many across?" "All of them, sir. They're coming across in 1 block." At the station, Dalton closed his eyes for a second. "Dr. Merritt, confirm the tide." Merritt looked at her watch, then at the river. "It already turned," she said. 4 minutes ago?" Nobody at Kalinda Crossing could see it happen, but the Arafura Sea had begun pushing 20 feet of water into a funnel 40 miles long, and physics had started collecting. The Veskin column reached the middle of the causeway at 5:26. The Marines fired exactly 1 volley, aimed high, into the shield lattice, for the sole purpose of confirming that the station was a target worth taking. The shields held perfectly. The column accelerated. Tarek's forward officer reported light resistance and requested permission to press through, and Tarek granted it. Because everything was going exactly according to a plan that had worked on 9 worlds. Then Private Danny Kessler, watching the water from the northern bank, keyed his radio. Staff Sergeant. There's a log coming up the channel. Kessler, this is not the time." "It's coming up the channel," Kessler said, "against the current." Brennan raised his binoculars. 19 feet of Deacon slid under the causeway's western edge, put 1 clawed foot on the concrete, and stopped there, in the exact center of the only route off the crossing. With his head turned slightly, so that 1 eye sat above the waterline. Brennan lowered the binoculars very slowly. "That's not a log," he said. The Veskin column's density scanner registered a large object at the western terminus and classified it as floating timber, consistent with the previous 11 contacts. The lead trooper stepped around it. Deacon did not lunge at the trooper. He did something far more efficient. He lifted his head 8 inches and brought his lower jaw down flat onto the surface of the water. A head slap is a territorial display. It is not an attack. It is a saltwater crocodile making a formal announcement, and it produces a crack like a rifle shot combined with a pressure wave that travels through water for hundreds of yards. Every crocodile in the bend received the message. And every one of them was, at that moment, sitting in the channel between the causeway and the 3 landing craft, directly across the only ground the Veskin Reserve would have to cross. On the eastern bank, Submarshal Tarek received 4 simultaneous reports. His forward column was halted. His density scanner was showing dozens of large objects in motion. His thermal grid was showing nothing whatsoever, and the water level at the landing site had risen 14 inches in 11 minutes. He made the decision that every commander in his position would have made. "Commit the reserve," he said. "Cross now." 80 Veskin troopers came down off the landing ramps and started across the flat toward the causeway at 5:41 in the morning, and the flat was no longer a flat. Top-end mud has 2 states and no transition between them. For 6 hours it is a road. Then the salt water comes back into it from below, and in the space of about 4 minutes it becomes a substance that a boot does not stand on so much as disappoint. The first rank of the reserve went into the ankle. The second rank went into the knee. The armored walker on the left flank put a foot down, found nothing, and knelt into the mud with the slow dignity of a monument being retired. And then the front came up the channel. It was not a wave. Movies get this wrong. It was a low, brown, moving step in the surface of the river about 2 feet high, running upstream against everything, carrying half the Arafura Sea behind it. And it went past the landing site at the speed of a jogging man and did not stop for the shield anchors. The anchors were rated for impact. They were not rated for 100,000 tons of salt water arriving from the wrong direction. The eastern shield failed first. Then the lattice folded in on itself, and the tactical picture went with it, and at the exact moment observer Pell lost the lattice. The storm that had been stacking over the Arnhem Land escarpment all night finally came off the plateau and put 900 lightning strikes into the floodplain in under 10 minutes. The orbital uplink burned out in the first 30 seconds. 240 Vescan troopers were now in the dark, in the mud, in the rain, in rising salt water, with no sensors, no communications, and no idea whatsoever what was in the river with them. The crocodiles knew exactly where everything was. They had been listening to the whole thing. What followed was not a battle. Dr. Katie Merritt would spend years correcting people about this. A battle requires two parties who agree that a battle is occurring. What happened on the Kalinda mudflat was a very large number of extremely territorial animals, discovering that a very large number of unfamiliar objects had entered their water at the exact hour. We're most inclined to care about it. Crocodiles do not chase. They wait, and they take what comes within one body length, and then they go straight back down. It is the most economical hunting strategy on Earth, and it is absolutely devastating to an opponent who cannot see it coming and has nowhere dry to retreat to. The Vescan reserve broke in under 4 minutes, not from casualties, from the arithmetic. You cannot hold a line when the ground is liquid, the water is rising, you cannot see, and the thing removing your flank does not appear on any instrument you own. On the causeway, squad leader Vosk did something that would be studied by his own species for a generation. Vescan doctrine states that where an apex predator dominates a region, that predator is frequently the totem or the escort animal of a dominant local intelligence, and contact should be attempted before force is used. Vosk, standing in 8 inches of water on a concrete slab in a thunderstorm, decided that the enormous armored reptile blocking his exit was clearly somebody's escort animal. So he opened a formal channel, engaged the translation matrix, and addressed it. "This unit acknowledges your territorial claim," Vosk announced, amplified in the pouring rain. "We request safe passage and wish to open negotiations with your handler." Deacon considered this for approximately 1 second. Then he slapped his jaw down onto the water again, hard enough to soak Vosk from the chest down, turned, and moved off the causeway with the unbothered efficiency of an animal who had made his point and had somewhere else to be. Vosk stood there dripping. "Log the response," he said. "As what?" Pell asked. "As a refusal." On the ridge, Corporal Weiss Tanner watched 160 aliens abandon a causeway that was now under 2 feet of moving water, and he said with genuine feeling, "They read the sign. They just didn't believe it. The Marines did not fire a single shot during the collapse. Dalton would not allow it. His order was 3 words long, and he repeated it 4 times over the net. Let them leave. There was one moment that morning that nobody at Kalinda ever made a joke about. Private Danny Kessler was on the northern bank when a Vescan trooper came off the causeway edge into the channel, and Kessler, who was 20 years old and from Ohio, and had been told his entire rotation to stay out of the water, went in after him up to his waist. He got a hand on the trooper's harness. Nalen Frey got a hand on Kessler's belt and hauled both of them backward onto the concrete so hard that all 3 went down in a heap. Frey did not shout at him. He just sat in the rain holding the back of Kessler's collar and looked out at the brown water, breathing. The river does not know what you meant to do. It does not know that you were being brave, or that the thing you were saving had come here to conquer your planet, or that you are somebody's son. It only knows depth and temperature, and how long you have been standing still. Every single person who works the top end learns that eventually, and the ones who learn it late do not get to explain it to anyone. Kessler sat there with the water running off his helmet and said, "Sorry, Staff Sergeant." "Don't be sorry," Brennan said, and his voice was not steady. "Just don't do it twice." By 6:18, the tide reached its peak. The causeway was gone under 8 feet of water. The mudflat at the bend had ceased to exist as a landform. 2 of the 3 Vescan landers had settled to the hull and taken salt water into their drive assemblies, and the 3rd lifted at 6:31 with as many troopers aboard as it could physically carry. Submarshal Tarek was the last officer off the flat. He stood in water up to his thighs in the last of the storm and looked back at a riverbank where he had lost an operation without ever locating an enemy. Somewhere out in the channel, something exhaled and did not surface. The sun came up on a river that looked exactly the way it had looked the previous morning. That was the part that got everyone. 22 Marines walked down to the crossing at 10 in the morning, and the water had gone back out, and the mud was hard and cracked and drying. And if you did not know what to look for, you would have said nothing had happened at Kalinda at all. 2 landing craft sat half sunk at the bend, with the tide draining out around them. Ellen Cobb drove down from the roadhouse and sold coffee out of the back of her truck to a research station, a Marine detachment, and eventually to 3 separate government agencies, at a price that would later be described in an audit as robust. Corporal Wheeze Tanner walked up the ridge and came back down carrying his camp chair. One additional leg was now bent. He set it up on the concrete apron above the crossing, sat in it, and read the 4 warning signs out loud. "Crocodiles inhabit this area," he said. "Attacks may cause serious injury or death. Do not enter the water." "You did that yesterday," said Danny Kessler. "Yeah," Tanner said, "and it worked." 900 miles above them, the Veskin debrief was less pleasant. Submarshal Tarek stood in front of a review board and gave the most honest report of his career. He had selected an optimal site by every metric in the doctrine. His sensors had functioned without fault. His troopers had followed procedure exactly. He had lost an operation, 2 landing craft, and the credibility of an entire expansion model, and he had never once identified the opposing force. "Then identify it now," the board said. Observer Pell submitted the finding. The opposing force had not been the 22 human soldiers. Those soldiers had fired 1 volley, aimed high, and had then spent the remainder of the engagement pulling Veskin troopers out of the water. The opposing force had not been artillery, or armor, or any technology at all. The opposing force had been an animal that the local population had already labeled, in writing, on 4 separate signs, at the exact location where the landing occurred. The board took a long time with that. The biological hazard index was rebuilt from the ground up. Level 6 was created for the termite structures. Level 7 for the amphibian with the chemical glands. Level 8 for the large horned quadruped that walked through shield anchors as a lifestyle choice. The saltwater crocodile was not assigned a number. Instead, the manual received a written entry, which is a thing the Veskin Dominion had only done twice in 600 years. It reads in full, "This organism is invisible to thermal detection because it has no heat of its own. It is invisible to motion detection because it does not move like prey. It is classified as debris by density scanning because it is shaped like debris, and it is shaped like debris on purpose. It has held its current design essentially unchanged since before this galaxy's dominant species learned to make tools, because the design does not require improvement. Do not enter the water. The local population has already told you this. The doctrine itself got 3 amendments. The first requires all landing sites on tidally influenced coastlines to be surveyed across a full lunar cycle, rather than a single observation. The second removes the clause classifying local warning markers as superstition, and replaces it with a clause requiring that every such marker be treated as a factual statement until disproven at 0 risk. The third is 1 line long, and it is the one that Veskin officers quote to each other. If the inhabitants have built a sign about it, they have already lost people to it. Earth was reclassified. Not the planet as a whole, which the Dominion considered manageable. Just the one continent, which received its own separate hazard annex and a recommendation of indefinite avoidance pending study. Squad leader Vosk was neither promoted nor disciplined. He was reassigned to survey, where he now teaches a mandatory module. Trainees are shown an image of a long brown shape floating in murky water, and Vosk asks them what it is, and every single class says the same thing, and he lets them say it. And then he tells them what it actually was. Down at the crossing, Major Ray Dalton filed his own report, and he made it as boring as he possibly could. He wrote that the detachment had observed a hostile landing, had assessed the environment, had established that the local tidal cycle and terrain were unsuitable for the hostile force, and had positioned itself accordingly. He wrote that no Marine was lost. He wrote that assistance was rendered to 11 hostile personnel recovered from the water. He did not write the sentence he actually said, out loud on the ridge. when the third lander finally went up through the last of the storm. Staff Sergeant Cole Brennan had asked him how he wanted the win recorded. "It isn't a win," Dalton said. "We didn't beat them. We just knew when the water was coming." Dr. Katie Merritt went back to work the following week because the fieldwork does not care what landed on it. She tagged 4 animals that season. She never located Deacon's transmitter because Deacon has never once permitted anyone to attach one. He is still there. He holds the same 4 miles. He has the same notch in his upper jaw and the same 2 missing scoots. And on a hot afternoon in the buildup, he lies on the same bank he was lying on before 3 landing craft ever came down out of the cloud, and he does not know that any of this happened. He was never defending Earth. He has never had an opinion about Earth. He had a bank and something stood on it, and it does not stand there now. That is the whole story of how the invasion of Northern Australia ended, not with a weapon. With a tide chart, a laminated card in a major's breast pocket, and an animal so perfectly built that the most advanced sensors in the galaxy looked directly at him and filed him under wood. If you made it this far, do me a favor and drop a comment. Tell me which part got you. The termite mounds, the tide, the negotiation on the causeway, or Vosk logging a crocodile's answer as a refusal. And share this with the one person you know who would absolutely have gone in the water anyway. Because here is the last thing, and it is the only thing that ever really mattered at Kalinda Crossing. 6 months later, a Veskin survey vessel passed over the top end at low altitude, mapping the coastline for the avoidance annex. Its imager caught a long brown shape lying motionless in the shallows of a tidal river, and the automatic classification system did what it was built to do and marked it as floating timber. An officer on that vessel leaned over the readout, looked at it for a long moment, and said the 4 words that are now printed on the cover of the manual. "That's not a log.